Shabbat Shalom and welcome. This is Torah study for a Shabbos morning, Shabbos afternoon. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein, joined this week, as always, by my dear friend and teacher, Rabbi Marc Gellman from South Florida. Marc, good morning, Shabbos.
Good Shabbos, my friend.
This morning we are deep in the story of the Exodus, third Parsha of the book of Exodus, the Parsha called Bo. Moses is bidden by God, come back to Pharaoh. It's interesting that it's Bo and not Lech. Come back.
They
Come
already
back
used
to your
up.
people.
They used that up.
Well, it's because what happens here, of course, is that Moses continues to meet the resistance. He meets the resistance of Pharaoh, and he meets the resistance of his own people. And in this parsha, we're really going to resolve. I'll give you the hint. Next week, we're going to get out of Egypt. But this is the parsha where the story resolves, the last of the plagues. And in the middle of the parsha, the story stops. The narrative is arrested, and we are given the commandments, first of all, to keep Jewish time. The Torah says that this is the beginning of months for you. You'll now keep your calendar from the month of Nisan, from the month in which Passover, because this is the beginning of Jewish time. So whereas Genesis is the beginning of cosmic time, this is the beginning of Jewish time. And more than that, we are given the commandment again and again to tell this story. The story must be told. And that's why this story is at the core. It's the master story of everything that is Jewish. This is the story that gives us our vision of history, our vision of good and evil. This is the story that gives us a sense of who God is and how God operates in the world, at least the way we would want God to operate in the world. It's a powerful story. Now, in the middle of this story, there is, of course, one concept which keeps coming back. This is a story, of course, about a power struggle. A power struggle between Moses, who is backed by God, and Pharaoh. And Moses and Pharaoh, ironically, of course, they're stepbrothers, as it were, right? They grew up in the palace together. That's what the movie keeps telling us. The Bible doesn't emphasize that, but it's clear because Moses speaks his language. Because when Moses stands in front of Pharaoh, he speaks Egyptian, and he apparently speaks it well enough to negotiate with the king of Egypt. So Moses and Pharaoh negotiating, and Moses on behalf of God, arguing, let my people go, and Pharaoh refusing and refusing and refusing. And the concept that is introduced is that Pharaoh's heart is hardened. At the beginning, it says he hardens his own heart. And then it says his heart is hardened. And then it says, God says, I'm going to harden his heart. So this raises certain kind of philosophical questions. The real question of, can he be held responsible if it's God who's hardening his heart? But in a deeper way, or a broader way, let's say, what does it mean to harden your heart? Is there a kind of evil that people engage in that in a certain way becomes so much part of them that they lose the power to turn in a different direction? In the 12 steps, when a person does a 12-step program, the first of the 12 steps, person confesses, I lost control of my life. I was powerless against this addiction, this enemy, this compulsion, alcohol, drugs, sex, shopping, whatever it is. And the 12 steps is a careful program to undo that powerlessness. Question mark is, and you're a philosopher of ethics, is there such an evil in the world that so grips us that we can't let it go, and it steals from us our power of choice?
Yeah, the way I explain this to children is, I think, for me, the deepest way of understanding it. Mostly that's true. What I try to explain to children is always the deepest truth, because I'm forced to simplify what otherwise would be obscure ideas. So when I teach kids, and this only works in the North, it doesn't work in Florida. I say, when you go out in or in LA, when you go out in the winter and you don't take your mittens, you know how your fingers get really cold, and it's just cold, and then they get really, really cold. And if you're so stupid that you don't get inside, go back in, get your mittens, but you want to play in the snow, eventually you can't feel your fingers. They get frozen they're on the way to being frozen. And if you stay out there, you get frostbite. I say that's what hardening the heart is about doing bad things. When you start out and you do a bad thing, usually you're all upset and you're shaking and you know you did a bad thing and you feel guilty and full of shame. But if you keep doing it, you don't feel that way after you do it a bunch of times. What's happened? What's happened is that your heart is hardened. It means that you no longer feel your natural inclinations to kindness and goodness and moral responsibility. And that's what hardening the heart is in its essence. It means you've done evil for so long that you're not capable of doing good. You may know that there's still good, but you can't get to it because you're just frozen. And I mean, that's the idea. So what it means is not that Pharaoh could have repented, but God stopped Pharaoh from repenting. It's a biblical way. For example, there's phrases in the Bible that God closed up her womb so she didn't have children. Rachel. Well, God didn't close up her womb. It just meant in the scheme of things where God controls everything, she was barren. Okay. So what this means is in the scheme of things, Pharaoh was incapable of change. He couldn't get around being an oppressor. He couldn't get around killing people and hurting people and being a slave master. He couldn't get out of it. And I think that takes away the moral point. At every point along the way, he theoretically had the chance to change, but he had so habituated himself to evil. And Maimonides makes this point, Luzzatto makes this point. Jewish philosophers all along the Middle Ages made the point, because the rabbis who were philosophically curious, which wasn't all of them, picked this up right away. They said, this is a problem. And that's how they interpreted. Their interpretation wasn't what I just said, but it was God did harden his heart, but only in order to punish him. Because if he had repented, God couldn't have punished him. And he was so worthy of being punished that that's what it meant. So that's how they dealt with it. But that's how I deal with it.
So let's push this a minute.
Okay.
We have had experience in our time with radical evil. We have had experience with, say, Nazi evil. We've had experience with Soviet evil. We've had experience with totalitarianism. We've had experience with, is that an example of a kind of evil that denies its practitioner any capacity to reflect on that evil, to choose differently? Was Hitler a man of hardened heart? Was Stalin a man of hardened heart? Would you put them into that category?
Yes, I would, but there's a big debate about it that goes back to Aristotle. For Aristotle, evil was what was called in the translations into Latin, privatio boni, the absence of good, which means for Aristotle, evil wasn't really a substantial thing at all. It was just the absence of a good thing. Another way to say that is people who do evil never really think they're doing evil. What they think is they're doing the right thing, but they're really misinformed or deluded, and they do the wrong thing, but they're intending to do the right thing. What the Holocaust shows, and as I told you, Frederick Copleston, the historian of philosophy, Jesuit priest, he said that's one of the lessons of the Holocaust, that some evil, Hitler, Stalin, Mao, some evil is radical evil, which is they know it's wrong, they know what they're doing, and they want to do it. But I don't know where that goes philosophically, because you could make the case Hitler thought he was doing a good thing by freeing Germany of the Jews.
Let's be pragmatic about this. So if you're dealing with somebody who is misinformed, so you say that the answer to evil is to change his mind, show him how he's misinformed, open his mind to moral alternatives. But if you're dealing with that kind of radical evil that Copleston is talking about, basically what you're saying, and maybe this is the lesson of the Torah, that the only way to stop radical evil is to whack them, to hit them. Because what happens next is the next set of plagues. You can see that there's a sort of escalation, right? The next set of plagues escalate, they up the game, right? Turning the river blood, the Nile into blood, or having frogs, or even lice or boils. These are horrible things. They're horrible and scary, but they're not life-threatening, right? The next set of plagues, you talk about hail that brings fire from heaven, right? Locusts that eat all the food in all of Egypt, a darkness that that covers the land so that people can't see each other, and ultimately the death of the firstborn. Is the lesson in the Torah then that when you meet radical evil, the only thing you can do is hit it with power, hit it with violence in a certain way, match its violence?
Yes, I think that is the lesson, and I think that is the truth. And that's that ambivalence. I know there were lots of reasons America didn't want to enter World War II that were pathetic. Let Stalin and Hitler kill each other, and we don't care about what happens to the Jews. Terrible motivations. But there was a point in the resistance to getting into the war, which was, look, we're not involved in trying to rid the world of evil. We're trying to live in the world, and you can't get rid of all the evil in the world. But after Pearl Harbor, we learned the lesson you just were saying, which is sometimes you have to kill the evildoer. The rabbis, who were the most peaceful people in the world, who extolled the virtue of powerlessness. Even in the Talmud, we read, Hashkem lahargacha, Hashkem lahargo. Someone comes to kill you, you're obligated to get up earlier in the morning, go out and kill them first. So there is just like there's this duality in us, that we're partly animal and partly spiritual. There's a duality in how we live in the world. Partly we can live as spiritual beings, trying to always find rapprochement and to try to find a way of explaining and reducing tensions, which of course you and I have dedicated our life to. But occasionally you need a soldier who's going to go into Europe and land on the beaches of Normandy and die in pools of blood, liberating Europe from radical evil. Sometimes that's what you need. And I think that is the mentality in Israel, because there is radical evil around Israel, and they are trying to destroy the state, and there is existential peril, and they fight with the blood of their own children. So I think the Jewish community in the world today is actually physically torn between these two principles. One, in America, well, we'll get along, we'll have some power, we'll try to influence and this, and then Israel, which is.
Well, I put it this way. There's two impulses in us. I think you're right. One is an aspiration. What is a dream? We should live in a world where evil can be dealt with education. We live in a world where we can heal the souls of people and not have to hurt their bodies. We live in a world where we pray for people to change their minds and to give up the evil within them. And we all would like that world, and we would love that. And that should be our first and second and third and fourth options whenever dealing with this. But there is such thing as a kind of evil in the world that won't work on. And when you meet that kind of evil in the world, it's actually self-destructive to imagine you can. Remember, there was this wonderful conversation between Martin Buber and Mahatma Gandhi. It's published now. It's a set of letters where Gandhi said you should have practiced nonviolent resistance in front of the Nazis. And Buber says you're dealing with a different kind of evil here. Buber, who was basically a pacifist, said you're dealing with a different kind of evil here. This is an evil, unlike the British, who were brutal, no question, in India. But unlike the British, the Nazis have no conscience. And lying down in front of them, they're just going to mow us down. And so even Buber said there's a time and a place, and that sometimes it's completely self-destructive to reach for that aspiration. Now, don't reach for it as a first option or a second option. And more than that, don't become a worshiper of that kind of violence. Don't make that violence into a drug that gives you a high. Don't make that violence, don't give your kid a toy that looks like a weapon and play with it. That kind of violence is a last option. It has its own unintended consequences, its own evil attached to it. But sometimes you got to use it. But sometimes you got to use it in the world.
And I think that's beautifully said and true. And it leads us to a point of pivot in our discussion about the Torah, and that is, what does all this stuff about the hardening of the heart of Pharaoh have to do with me and my life? What does it have to do with us? And I think you've basically pointed to the exact moment of switch in which we can say, this is how it affects me. And that is, we all face situations in our life where we harden our hearts. Michael Harrington has said the problem with the Cross Bronx Expressway being built is that we don't drive through poor neighborhoods anymore there, and you don't see the poverty, and therefore you aren't moved by the poverty. And another way of saying this is we have habituations that are destroying our culture. For example, pornography, the flood of pornography destroys our capacity to link love and sex. Pornography separates love and sex in sometimes brutal and horrible ways, and desensitizes the viewers, they're largely our kids, but not only, to healthy relationships. I fully confess that I'm on the edge of habituating about food. I watch food programs and they, show beautiful dishes from around the world, and I call it food porn.
Food porn.
Food porn. And I understand it furthers within me an unhealthy attitude toward food. And I understand that as a habituation. When you look at the popular movies, shoot 'em up action movies, I mean, on an average, like hundreds of people die in the movie. They don't really die, but they go shoot, boom, boom, down, you fall down dead. And kids are watching this, and people watch this. And I refuse to believe that it doesn't have a coarsening effect on our capacity to talk things through. And then the other element of this habituation to evil and habituated behavior that comes to us, I feel it. I give to all beggars. When I see beggars, and you stop at a stop sign and they're asking for money, and I always give them money. And my kids, when they were in the house, they would yell at me always, "Dad, you stupid, don't you see? They're going to go and they're going to buy drugs, they're going to buy booze, and you're just helping them." And I said, well, yeah, maybe, maybe there's a chance that that's true, maybe a big chance. And if they do that, then the sin of taking my money is on them. But let's suppose they're really down and out and hungry, and they've been forced to be beggars, which is a huge personal embarrassment. But they're begging. And if they're really in need and I don't give it to them, then the sin transfers to me. It means that my heart is hardened. And it's worth whatever the money is I give them to keep my heart soft, so that when I see people, I don't turn away from them. And there's the great Hasidic story, I think it's Nachman, says to his people, he's walking, says, who's that across the street? And they say, that's nobody, that's Moshe, the water drawer. He says, no, none of you are my students. You can't be my students unless you look across the street and no matter who you see, you say to me, Rabbi, across the street is walking the image of God. And so those are my feelings about how Pharaoh's hardened heart has a place in our own lives.
So it raises a different question, though. You see, so we talked about radical evil, an evil that does evil for its evil's sake, that can only be stopped with an act of power, an equal act of power. But you're raising a different issue now, and that's the question of complicity. Complicity. See, it wasn't just that Pharaoh's heart was hardened; Egypt's heart was hardened. Remember that the Israelites had become part of Egyptian society. Egyptian society, not just one guy, but Egyptian society enslaves them. So the question is, to what extent, first of all, how did he do that? How do you get an entire society to be complicit in an act of radical evil? It's one of the great questions about Nazi Germany that it's being debated all over. Daniel Koldhagen, the professor from Harvard, who talks about the policemen and the shopkeepers and the normal German citizens who weren't Nazis but were complicit in the destruction of European Jewry. How did Pharaoh get the whole people to be complicit? And what is the kind of evil? What kind of evil is complicity? And then what you're asking is even a deeper question, which was, how do I make sure that I'm not complicit in evils that are going around, that I'm not specifically, that I didn't initiate, but I'm witnessing and I'm become accustomed to that. Heschel's famous saying that some are responsible, but all are guilty. No, some are guilty, but all are responsible.
Right.
Some are guilty, but all are responsible. Right? All of us are responsible for homelessness in our cities. All of us are responsible for the degradation of certain neighborhoods in urban areas. So we're all responsible. How do you keep from being complicit to that kind of thing? And that's a different kind of evil. That's another hardening of the heart.
Yes.
Because I see it, but I don't do anything about it.
Right. And then eventually you don't see it.
And then you don't see it. Then it exits your visual screen. As Moshe, you don't have to worry about Moshe, he's a nobody. You don't have to worry about Moshe, he doesn't count. That's a different kind of hardening of the heart.
Yeah. I mean, look, I live in a gated community in Florida, one of 9 zillion gated communities. And it's a wonderful thing. And there's lots of amenities. And, there's a guy at a gatehouse who says, why would anyone you want to see Rabbi Gellman? Why would you want that? And it's nice. But on the other hand, it's very, very restricting, because everything I see is me. I see people like me everywhere. And I don't see homeless people, and I don't see hungry people. And, I don't see people who are victims of crime. And that hardens my heart.
Right.
So I think there's a price we pay for every decision we make for our comfort and our security.
So there's a beautiful set of midrashim about the 10 plagues, which we're reading in the Torah this week. That the 10 plagues are midah keneged midah, measure for measure.
Right.
The Egyptians threw Israelite children into the Nile, so the Nile flows red with blood. The Egyptians tried to destroy the fertility of the Israelite people. So frogs, which was the Egyptian symbol of fertility, spread over the world with no limits, right? And in this case, you come to the ninth plague, which is the plague of darkness. And the tradition was that this wasn't just darkness. This is just like an eclipse or a nighttime. This was a darkness which was palpable. It was thick darkness. You ever been in London on a really foggy day, or San Francisco on a foggy day? But this was even more. Said the tradition, this is a darkness so dark that a person couldn't see the person next to them.
Exactly.
You can't see each other. You can't see the pain of the other. You can't see what you've done to the other. So this is midah keneged midah, measure for measure, the punishment of the Egyptians who allowed this slavery to exist in their society and didn't see what they were doing to a resident Israelite population. And now they live 3 days in this ferociously horrifying darkness, moral darkness, a moral blindness to one another.
Yes.
And that's the other kind of evil we're dealing here. That evil can be extinguished with a certain kind of education, a certain kind of change.
Definitely. The way we eat. You say, I'll just go for, a hamburger at a fast food joint. Yeah, well, but those hamburgers at the fast food joint are made with beef that they source from the Amazon River Valley, the river delta, where people are cutting down the rainforest to make areas for cows so they can raise them cheaply to sell them to the fast food place for a nickel, $1 less a pound. But the end result is it destroys the ecosystems of the world. So I think they can sometimes be very preachy, and they can sometimes be very difficult to deal with. But the people who are talking to us about the ethics of our eating, I think, have a real point. And there's other elements to it. A lot of us are sympathetic to the criticisms against woke culture, that you're constantly criticizing somebody because every word out of their mouth is a prejudicial word in some way. And that's too much, I agree. But there is a point that woke culture is making that we need to learn from. And that is, our evil is so ubiquitous and it's seeped so deeply into us that we have to be extraordinarily careful and vigilant and wise to get it out of us. And that's what changing the world, changing ourselves. I mean, that was Gandhi, be the change you seek in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the story of Pharaoh's hardened heart is our story too.
Yeah.
That's what I would say.
So let's conclude. The conclusion of the Parsha, something amazing happens. The last of the plagues, which is the most horrifying, the death of the firstborn.
Right.
And in the middle of the night, Pharaoh calls to Moses and says, take your people and get out of my land. He gives him what he's been waiting for. Take your people and get out of my land. Take your children, take your flocks, take your stuff, and get out of my land. And then there's 2 words that are added to the end of that sentence, ubarachtem gamani. Bless me too. Bless, Pharaoh at the end says, bless me too, 3 words, bless me too. What does that tell you, Marc? What does that tell you about what happened to Pharaoh, where he is at that moment? Bless me too.
Well, if that was the end of the story, it would be a pathetic and moving end. But it isn't the end, because in the end, as
we got another chapter. Don't give it away. It's coming.
I
next
won't,
week.
but there's a possibility.
There's a possibility.
He didn't mean what he said. And I don't know, you've probably learned this. I certainly learned it from my initial contacts and some counseling with drug addicted people who came to me, and I tried to refer them out to professional care. Sometimes I was successful, sometimes I wasn't. But one thing that overwhelmed me in my discussions with them was that what they said to me was always a lie. Basically, one of the casualties of their addiction was their capacity to tell the truth. And they would look at me and say, I didn't do this, I did this. None of it was true. None of it was true. And yet they looked at me and they convinced me. And, couldn't you write a letter to the judge and do something? And the end result of it was, you can't listen to what people say. You have to look at what people do. And Pharaoh at the end said the right thing, but there wasn't one moment in his life when he did the right thing.
So I'm going to be more charitable. Would that be okay?
Sure.
I think that there are experiences in life that reduce us and break us and bring us back to primary processes. Bless me too. Who else said bless me too in the Torah? Esau said bless me too. So and they're both considered Rishaim, evil guys, right? But I think that there's a moment. I'm going to be more charitable to Pharaoh, if that's okay. He loses his son.
How do you explain his change?
No, I will. But at this moment, he's so wounded because he's lost his child. He's lost his successor. He's lost his future. He has really been defeated. He has really confronted his own powerlessness and vulnerability. Up until now, he's the God. But for him to say, bless me too, means I'm not the God. And I don't think he's acknowledging God. I think he may be acknowledging Moses, but I think it's a moment of complete surrender and complete brokenness. And then what happens is sometimes out of that brokenness comes the most arrogant kind of response, a sort of embarrassment at that vulnerability, which is going to lead to next week's Parsha. I think that may be it. But at this particular moment, bless me too, I think for just a moment you glimpse that there is a human being behind that mask, and he's broken and he's weak and he's scared, and there's a bless me too inside of many of us, I think. Maybe.
I don't know. There's a phrase among the Christians, I think it's Niebuhr who invented it. It's called easy grace, cheap grace.
Yeah, instant karma, right.
Yeah, which is, okay, I'm a Christian, say, and I've killed hundreds of thousands of millions of people, and at the last moment of my life, I give myself to Jesus or whatever, and that's supposed to wipe it all out? And
No. I just think that you're seeing something. I think that the experience of losing a child at this point breaks this man, and that's what you're seeing here. Bless me too. I'm not the one in charge of the universe. I'm not the one. Maybe this is the hope that even radical evil can be healed. Maybe.
Halavai.
Halavai. Let's end with an halavai. Marc, thank you for learning with me. Thank you to everyone for learning with us. Stay tuned, of course. Shabbos morning at 10 o'clock, Valley Beth Shalom presents our Shabbos services. Wonderful bar mitzvah this week. And all week, come and learn with us. Take good care. Marc, stay well.
Love you, Eddie. Good
Shabbat
job.
Shalom.